Hi there. Okay, this information has been collated over a few years, and some of the information is research in collaboration with someone else who prefers to stay anonymous. I nearly made this documentary 2 years ago, but I didn't feel I had enough jigsaw pieces. So what is geology? The word is derived from the ancient Greek, the first part meaning earth and the second part meaning logos. Geology is really now known as the study of the physical features of our earth, such as the rocks and soils of which it is composed, and the processes acting upon them by which they change over time. What I'm going to do is lay out many jigsaw pieces, subjects such as coal, granite, rock-cut caves, rock-cut temples, layers of strata, basalt columns, mud floods, cataclysm, and much more, and indirectly present just how much the elite and their education system lies about geology and our history. And in turn, I will also present what can be seen as logically and rationally true. In the deep state matrix upon the cosmology lie of the spinning ball, the elite use National Geographic as deep state mind control, and they also use the History Channel as deep state mind control, to both sway the masses about geology and history. Now, National Geographic is owned by 21st Century Fox, a mass media corporation floating on the stock exchange and funding many toxic Hollywood movies. Disney is soon to buy out and acquire 21st Century Fox too, for around $70 billion. The History Channel, however, is already owned by Disney, so it's literally true that mainstream geology and history are both Mickey Mouse. So the cosmology lies, the geology lies, and the history lies all linked together. It's lies on top of lies, and any serious researcher can't really look at one and not the other two. Now, Michael Jackson said this just before they bumped him off and discredited him.
And they manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie.
That's right, Michael.
The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that.
Now remember, nobody has ever said, I know geology. It's a very big jigsaw with many sub-subjects, but I've now got enough pieces I feel are worth sharing. Let's start with coal. The official story is coal was formed millions of years ago when the earth was covered with huge swampy forests where giant ferns, reeds and mosses grew. As the plants grew, some died and fell into the swampy waters. New plants grew, and when these died, still more grew. In time, there were thick layers of dead plants forming separate layers. They say that after millions of years, the weight of the top layers and the water and dirt packed down the lower layers of plant matter. Heat and pressure produced chemical and physical changes in the plant layers, which forced out oxygen and left rich carbon deposits, which we know as coal. They say most of the coal we use now was formed around 300 million years ago. There is an estimated 1 trillion tons of coal reserves worldwide, pretty much in every country. But Dr. Robert Gentry and his son David, in the 1970s, proved this fairy tale is a load of spinning balls.
Is it really true that this piece of coalified wood from LaSalle, Utah, and this piece of coalified wood from Temple Mountain, Utah, are really 140 million years older than this piece of wood which David and I recently obtained in some of our experiments? Not really. Locked in these and other coalified wood specimens from uranium mines is some remarkable evidence that tells quite a different story. To see that evidence requires that the coalified wood specimens be mounted in epoxy, thinly sliced, and then placed on glass slides for observation under the microscope. Under the microscope can be seen discolorations produced by radioactive particles ejected from tiny centers. Some are circular, others are elliptical, as can be seen in these photographs. These circular and elliptical halos required a special sequence of events to form, so special in fact that they completely overthrow the idea of an ancient age of coal, pointing instead to coal's recent formation, geologically speaking. To explain the halos requires that at one time, water-saturated logs were buried in what are now considered to be several different geologic formations: the Eocene, Jurassic, and Triassic.
Hang in there.
Later, uranium solutions infiltrated those water-saturated logs, and uranium decay products, radioactivity, was collected at tiny sites in each of those logs.
Don't get bored.
That radioactivity decayed over the next several months to a half year, ejecting particles and producing spherical radiation-damaged regions, halos around those tiny sites. In cross-section, they appear to be circular. They were formed by the decay of secondary polonium, derived from the decay of uranium. Then there was a compression event. Something applied pressure to the top of all these formations. The logs were compressed, and when the logs were compressed, the halos were compressed. This brings us to an important point. We know that these logs had not turned to coal at the time the compression occurred. Here's a piece of coal. Coal doesn't compress. It shatters, as we can easily see.
Nice shoes. Go with the slacks, quite nice.
All the information we've seen thus far would indicate that these events were simultaneous in all these geologic formations. But there is even more evidence of that. When uranium invaded the wood, it left some of its decay product since the time that it invaded the wood. I've measured both the amount of uranium in these coalified logs and also the amount of lead, the decay product. On the assumption that the decay of uranium to lead has been uniform, it's an assumption we'll discuss later, we arrive at the conclusion that all these logs were buried together quite recently. How recently? In 1976, I published my results of the studies on these logs in the October 15, 1976 issue of Science. Here's what I said in this report. Such extraordinary values, referring to these lead-uranium ratios, admit the possibility that both the initial uranium infiltration and coalification could possibly have occurred within the past several thousand years. In other words, I was suggesting that coal could form very rapidly, geologically speaking. It contradicted the conventional way in which people have thought about the formation of coal. What was the reaction of the scientific community to this new data?
Answers on a postcard?
I received a letter from Professor Raphael Kazman of Louisiana State University several months later.
Emails quicker.
January 27, 1977. Dear Dr. Gentry, I have been patiently scanning the letters section of Science since the publication by you and your colleagues of your findings on radio halos. The silence is deafening. I think it can be interpreted as stunned silence.
The findings went into the GeoTimes publication too.
If isotope ratios are to be used as a basis for geologic dating, then presently accepted ages may be too high by a factor of 10,000, admitting the possibility that the ages of the formation are to be measured in millennia. Translated, that means several thousand years for the formation of coal and all of those geologic formations.
Oh dear.
This information has remained unchallenged and unrefuted in the open scientific literature since it was published in 1976.
So, what else have we got?
Years ago, when a mining company excavated the layers exposing the tree, the bottom of the tree could be seen extending down to the lower coal seam. Since that time, the lower part of the tree has broken off. Even now, in its reduced length, the tree extends through layers geologists normally theorize to have taken hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate. But these layers could not have taken long ages to accumulate because the tree would have rotted long before the sediments would have had time to accumulate around it. Rather, this tree is mute testimony to its catastrophic burial by at least 2 sequences of volcanic ash deposits. As the evidence indicates, the tree was probably buried in a series of closely spaced volcanic ash flows, perhaps similar to the catastrophic burial of thousands of trees at Mount St. Helens in Washington state.
And
the Eagle Butte Mine boasts of coal layers or seams with thicknesses ranging up to 120 feet. Eagle Butte Mine is part of a much larger coal-rich area known as the Powder River Basin. This gigantic 10,000 square mile reserve, situated between the Black Hills of South Dakota on the east and the Bighorn Mountains on the west, the immensity of the Powder River Basin coal deposits has attracted the attention of geologists for decades. Such interest was documented in the May 1993 issue of Earth magazine. The article, Powder River Coal, Geologic Enigma, Environmental Dilemma, included these statements. Powder River's coal seams run remarkably thick and unsullied by other material. Usually unwanted sediment such as clay washes over a deposit before coal seams can get very thick. But Powder River coal is packed in immense strips, some more than 200 feet thick. These seams stretch vast distances up and down the basin. They're hundreds of miles long. They're 50 miles wide, says James McClurg, a geologist at the University of Wyoming. They're not little pods of an acre or two. They're immense things. McClurg, who studied the basin for more than a decade, says no other place in the world has as many seams 50 feet or more thick. But the Powder River Basin is not only an economic resource. To geologists, it's also an intriguing scientific enigma. Geologists have been studying the basin for more than a century, largely to answer a baffling question. How did the seams get so massive? Or more precisely, why weren't the seams diluted by influxes of clay and other impurities before they thickened? As McClurg puts it, how on earth did things remain constant enough so that you can get 200 feet of coal? The genesis of any kind of coal demands a precise sequence of events, however. If you don't get all of them, you don't get coal, explains McClurg.
so,
Earlier we took a piece of wood like this, inserted it in this steel pipe, added some water,
just wood and water.
and then sealed it up. The next step is to put it in the oven at about 160 degrees centigrade for 2 weeks. Now we're ready to examine the results of this experiment.
Nice music, nice shirts.
As we can see, this wood is now darker in color. It's also softer. A chemical reaction between the steam and the wood under pressure has caused these changes to occur. This specimen isn't coal yet, but clearly the process of coalification has begun. Successful formula combined lignin and clay with heat, about 150 degrees Celsius, in the absence of oxygen. Over a period of about 8 months, artificial coal was produced.
So there is evidence supporting rapid coal formation. Coal is better explained by a rapid deposition and burial of billions of tons of vegetation by a massive flood or cataclysm a few thousand years ago. Let's look at the next jigsaw piece, granite. Now I know this is a little boring at the moment, it'll get more exciting later, but we have to go through this information first to form the basis for the right conclusions. Granite is the signature rock of Earth itself. Much of the Earth's continental crust is made of granite, and it also forms the core of most land and most mountain ranges. Let me share with you for a few minutes the mainstream geology story of granite. It is an igneous rock, which means it was formed during the cooling of molten rock, from the slow crystallization of magma below Earth's surface. During the formation of granite, it is buried below kilometers of rock and sediment necessary to produce enough heat to melt rock. Of course, the granite we see today is near the surface, and thus at some point was uplifted, causing overlying sediment to be shed via erosion. Granite always consists of the minerals quartz and feldspar, with or without a wide variety of other minerals known as accessory minerals. Two examples of large exposed granites are Half Dome and Stone Mountain. Pluton is a general term that covers the whole variety of shapes taken by bodies of magma. The magmas slowly rose through the crust like great balloons and solidified near the surface to form gigantic bodies of granite called plutons, which are exposed later when uplift and erosion remove the overlying rock and sediment. A pluton exposed at the Earth's surface may represent the deep part of a magma chamber that once fed magma to a long-vanished volcano. Okay, mainstream geology states that granite is mostly Precambrian age, which is over 540 million years old. Other mainstream sources say between 100 million years and 2.7 billion years old, depending on the accessory minerals. Okay, that's all the official story. Here is some information to show that the mainstream age of granite is highly possibly a load of spinning balls.
The startling new evidence is found deep beneath the Earth, below layers of sedimentary rock down in its primordial stones, the granites. There, tiny bits of radioactive matter have formed what scientists call radiohalos. They've left telltale traces, creating a discolored sphere around them. Scientists can identify precisely what kind of material caused these radiohalos by measuring their sizes. One U.S. scientist, Dr. Robert Gentry, has examined more than 100,000 of these phenomena.
Old school XL.
Dr. Gentry has discovered a type of radiohalo that just shouldn't be there. In fact, according to every basic principle of evolutionary theory, it just can't be there. It's impossible. But after years of vigorous experimenting and testing, there is now no doubt.
I have identified polonium radiohalos in the Earth's basement granites from America, Canada, Scandinavia, Europe, Russia, Japan, and Madagascar. This is extraordinary because these polonium isotopes have a very fleeting existence. One type I've identified, polonium-218, occurs for only a few minutes before decaying into something else. And yet this radioactive element has imprinted its identifying halo in solid granite, in particular in these pieces from the White Mountains in New Hampshire and from Neji in Japan. The three sunburst patterns shooting out from the tiny center represent three different energy nuclear particles that were successively ejected from three different isotopes of polonium encased within the tiny center. The accumulated effects of millions of such particles discolored the mineral around the center, thus producing three microscopic-sized, concentric colored spheres. In the mineral, the halo is always three-dimensional. Under the microscope, however, it looks flat. By taking a thin slice of the mineral through the center, we have effectively cut off the top and the bottom of the spheres and are thus left to view the halo as a series of three concentric rings under the microscope, as is illustrated in this animation sequence. According to all present scientific theories, granites, such as this specimen from Pikes Peak in Colorado, originated in a molten state, cooled, crystallized, and hardened over millions of years deep in the earth. But if that's the case, the radioactivity produced by polonium would never have been captured. It would have decayed away long before the rock solidified. The grains of polonium that made these radio halos were embedded deep in the granite. The element was there somehow when the rock was formed, but it could only form its radio halo after the rock had already hardened. And if polonium exists for only a few seconds or minutes, the implication has stunned all those who are willing to listen. Polonium radio halos indicate that the Earth's foundation rocks, the granites, were formed almost instantly. In fact, they are evidence that the granites had to be formed instantly. Scientifically, they cannot be accounted for in any other way.
We can demonstrate the principle of polonium radio halos. Imagine this Alka-Seltzer tablet is a bit of polonium, and this glass of water is a piece of molten granite. I drop the tablet in, and it begins to fizz. Think of these bubbles as the radiation emitted by that bit of polonium embedded in the granite. This fizz will go away in about 30 seconds, and we'll have nothing left but a slightly tangy glass of water. Now, is there any way we could preserve these bubbles as they are? We could try placing the glass in the freezer. The water, of course, would solidify after a while. That's something similar to what evolutionary theory suggests, that molten rock slowly cools to form granite. But as you've already guessed, freezing this glass of Alka-Seltzer wouldn't do any good. The bubbles will have gone long before the water turns to ice. And that's exactly what would have happened to polonium radiation if the granite had slowly cooled. It would have disappeared long before any radio halos could have been imprinted in the solid rock. If I show you a frozen glass of water with all the fizz of a tablet still intact, like this, you will know that something happened to instantly freeze the water. In this case, we merely froze it instantly in time by a pause of the videotape. Likewise, if we look at a radio halo demonstrated unmistakably to have been produced by a certain kind of polonium, we can know that the granite around it had to be formed instantly.
Is he just some maverick scientist conducting his work in virtual isolation? If his experimental results were brought to the light, would other scientists be able to quickly discredit them? As a matter of fact, Dr. Gentry conducted most of his research on radio halos at the Oak Ridge National Laboratories in Tennessee. His findings have been published in many of the world's leading scientific journals: Science, Nature, Geophysical Research Letters, Earth and Planetary Science Letters, Physical Review Letters, Annual Reviews of Nuclear Science. Papers appearing in these journals are subject to peer review. That is, other scientists in the same field carefully examine the evidence presented and the experimentation used to see if there are any flaws in the data.
Till today, no scientist has debunked these experiments and findings, even though they've been in many peer-reviewed publications. One debunk theory going around the internet is that they are not radio halos, but this theory has not been published seriously or scientifically. The actual how the granite was created in a short space of time we will come to later. Let's look at the next jigsaw piece, layers of strata. Okay, let's go mainstream first. What do Mickey Mouse corporations like National Geographic, the History Channel, and your liberal primary school robot repeater teacher dish out? A strata, plural for one stratum, are layers of sedimentary rock or soil with consistent characteristics and qualities that distinguish it from other layers. In normal strata, the later strata are laid down on earlier strata in horizontal layers. In the very long passage of time, sedimentary rocks may get deformed by huge forces in the earth, such as volcanism, mountain building, or other causes. Then it requires individual research to work out what has happened to the individual strata. So how is the age of geological strata determined in the mainstream Disney world? Whatever is under something is older than it. For example, what's on top is youngest. They say that itself doesn't tell you how old something is, but it tells you the relative ages. They say the best and most precise dating method uses radioactive decay of isotopes within the rocks. They say the layers of strata built up over tens of millions of years, and in many cases hundreds of millions of years. Some mainstream geologists say that strata are the result of one volcano, then later another, then another, spanning hundreds of millions of years. It doesn't matter where you look, you will find all the mainstream gatekeepers singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to the age of strata. The issue is that the field of geochronology is highly technical and fraught with problems, especially when looking at larger time spans. To think humans can date something to anything over 1 million years, for me, is completely ludicrous and insane. So again, let's prove that the mainstream aging of strata is wrong and a lie. The key here lies with the Mount St. Helens volcano in Washington, in the Pacific Northwest of the USA. Its May 1980 eruption was one of the largest volcano eruptions in America in the past century.
Almost 10,000 feet tall, Mount St. Helens is one of several active volcanoes in Washington's Cascades mountain range. By 1980, it hasn't erupted for over a century. But beneath its serene exterior, Mount St. Helens is beginning to stir. On March 27th, red-hot magma from deep within the volcano rises high enough to come into contact with icy meltwater.
No matter where you are on Earth, there's beneath you somewhere there's water. So if something hot comes up into that water, it heats it up. It can build up enough pressure that it finally just breaks through as an explosion, like a pressure cooker you're just letting loose.
Most scientists expect that if the mountain does blow, it will be in a classic vertical eruption, affecting only a limited area close to the volcano. But the mountain could explode sideways in a lethal lateral eruption, devastating a much larger area. At 8:32 a.m. on May 18th, 1980, they get their answer.
We are directly above Mount St. Helens now, and there is no question that the volcanic activity has started. Smoke.
A massive earthquake causes the huge bulge on the mountain to collapse, removing a mile-wide chunk of the north face. With an energy equivalent to 1,500 Hiroshima atom bombs, rock and superheated gas shoot from the volcano at terrifying speeds of up to 400 miles per hour. Such is the force of Mount St. Helens' lateral eruption that an incredible 1,300 feet of mountain disappears almost instantly. Now the eruption enters its next phase. Expanding magma inside the volcano sends thousands of tons of scorching rock and gas high into the atmosphere. A dense plume of ash stretches 15 miles high. The choking ash fills the air outside, turning the sky dark. Breathing becomes almost impossible. In the minutes after the eruption, 46 billion gallons of icy meltwater start to pour down the mountainside, gathering rock and debris to create a lethal slurry called a lahar. The deadly lahar becomes a massive tsunami of destruction. Scientists scramble into the air to get an overview of the unfolding disaster.
Okay, this was a devastating eruption. The top 1,000 feet of the volcano blew off. This is nearby forests. The reach of the ash. I think 57 people died and over 200 houses destroyed. And of course, massive hot mud and rock tsunamis and floods and rivers occurred. This whole bridge and whole areas were covered in these volcanic rivers. But what's the key to strata from this eruption? What's the link? What's the key? The key is after the Mount St. Helens eruptions and mudslides in the 1980s, geological layers of strata were formed really fast. The layers didn't form in millions of years how the elite want us to believe. The image you see now These layers of rock were all created in 3 hours. A man named Dr. Stephen Austin did some great research in this area about rapidly formed stratification. He wrote, "Up to 400 feet thickness of strata have formed since 1980 at Mount St. Helens. These deposits accumulated from primary air blast, landslide, waves on the lake, pyroclastic flows, mud flows, airfall, and stream water. Perhaps the most surprising accumulations are the pyroclastic flow deposits amassed from ground hugging, fluidized, turbulent slurries of fine volcanic debris, which moved at high velocities off the flank of the volcano as the eruption plume of debris over the volcano collapsed. These deposits include fine pumice ash luminae and beds from 1 millimeter thick to greater than 1 meter thick, each representing just a few seconds to several minutes of accumulation. A deposit accumulated in less than 1 day. On June 12, 1980, it's 25 feet thick and contains many thin laminae and beds. Conventionally, sedimentary laminae and beds are assumed to represent longer seasonal variations or annual changes, as the layers accumulated very slowly. Mount St. Helens teaches us that the stratified layers commonly characterizing geological formations can form very rapidly by flow processes. Such features have been formed quickly underwater in laboratory sedimentation tanks, and it should not surprise us to see that they have formed in natural catastrophe. Let's see more from Dr. Stephen Austin. What a legend!
We're here at this cliff on the North Fork of the Toutle River, which shows the very beautifully preserved pyroclastic flow deposits from June 12th, 1980. Late in the evening, about 9 p.m. to midnight, this deposit was formed rapidly during 3 hours. You can see the effect of the pyroclastic flows. The coarse and the fine material is separated into thin layers called laminae. And the laminated appearance of the pyroclastic flow deposits is really interesting because it shows us that particles can be separated at high speed. These pyroclastic flows were moving at about 100 miles per hour. As the grains were being propelled over the surface in a slurry, the particles separated coarse and fine into thin layers. I had thought that a catastrophe would mix up all the particles and make a homogenized deposit. Boy, was I wrong. Right here, a pyroclastic flow moving at freeway speed or higher can separate particles into coarse and fine. So layering doesn't require millions of years, thousands of years, or even hundreds of years. It can form rapidly in this slurry flow process. So Mount St. Helens tells us something really interesting about how rapidly strata can form. There's even micro-thin lamination in this deposit. It's remarkable.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Mickey Mouse mainstream's been telling porcupines again. Big fat lies. Oh dear. I would say these lies are, they really are, let's call them what they are, they're spinning balls. Spinning ball standards. These are Mickey Mouse, mainstream, gatekeeper, blatant lies. Changing the subject a little, the name Stephen Austin rings a bell. Steve Austin, who, I got it. Steve Austin was the name of the $6 million man from the TV series in the 80s. Well, I see Dr. Stephen Austin as the 6 million lies debunk man, or the 10 million years debunk man. Good work. Okay, I think it's getting pretty obvious to say at this juncture that coal, granite, and layers of strata can all be created quickly by large cataclysmic events. There's still much information to come to support this, and we're starting to get to the meat of the documentary. Let's look at the next jigsaw piece, rock-cut caves and rock-cut temples. This is where the big fat jigsaw piece is going to put the elite's geological Pinocchio to sleep forever. This is going to be the biggest section, so strap in. The mainstream labelled rock-cut caves and rock-cut temples are found all over the world. The mainstream universities, archaeology, history and geology all state the same thing Wikipedia states. Centuries ago, people with a hammer and chisel cut out these caves, temples, tombs and sculptures from solid rock. In some cases, the caves were already there, and they just went to work improving it with their hammer and chisel to create tombs, houses, temples and towns. Now try not to laugh. In India alone, there are 1,500 rock-cut caves. Mostly, they say, were a religious practice to create a temple out of solid rock. All 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, they say. Okay, so what's really going on? Right. In every country of flat Earth, there has been found directly encased in strata and hard stone animal bones, human bones, trees, and all sorts of petrified plant life. Remember, not covered by sand or by dirt or mud, but directly in the rock strata itself. As a quick side note, whenever bones are found, and some large human bones appear to have been found, the minions from the Smithsonian Institute arrive and they confiscate the bones. So what else was covered by the rock strata? Ancient towns, temples and cities. The ancient world is buried right beneath many of us, and many of the ancient cities lay covered by mountains and hills which formed during the last cataclysm. But when we come to the buildings covered in hard strata, the fairy tale of the so-called rock-cut caves appears. Today, all the rock-engulfed cities, caves and temples are under the UNESCO World Heritage Mafia. These traitors are careful to protect the monuments, but really protect the lie. And most employers don't even know, they simply just do what they're told, a bit like a basic NASA employee. Okay, these temples are not cut out of rock with crude tools, they were already there before the cataclysm. They were stone originally because the ancients built with huge blocks of stone. The lava or volcanic floods or volcanic sandstone covered the cities and temples and encased them in stone. Archaeologists are somewhat baffled on how come 2,000 years ago people were able to achieve a magnificent carving technique in soft sandstone without collapsing the roof. The truth is that these buildings were never built inside the rock walls. These were surface level buildings just like buildings today. They got covered in strata, stroke lava. All of these monuments, no matter where they are in the world and what culture built them, they always have the same weird characteristics. They look as if they were done intentionally to resemble a normal exterior building. They are in ruins and they present strong evidence of destruction. And they have a weird mixture of extremely advanced architecture mixed with poor and rudimentary chiseling. This is contradictory and suspicious. So in the past times, people found a part of these cities or temples and started to dig and chisel inside them, driven by curiosity and trying to find treasure maybe. Also in many cases the digging was done by the survivors of Cataclysm in order to restore their former homes, towns and temples. And later, in order to hide the truth, the elite, read Vatican and Brotherhoods at the time, decided to cut the exterior walls so that it wouldn't be too obvious, and they tried to make the entrances of these buried monuments to look like some sort of rock-cut caves. When mainstream archaeology tells us that a rock-cut temple was built by King X in the Y dynasty, it's just National Geographic's and the History Channel's Disney overlords propaganda, with zero facts and zero evidence. Okay, let's take a temple that was not covered by strata or lava. Angkor Wat was built from sandstone blocks, So let's say that at the next cataclysm it wouldn't be so lucky and it will be covered in sandstone. And some parts will not be completely covered, so that survivors will be able to see it and they will begin to chisel inside the temple chambers. Currently at Angkor Wat we can clearly see the bindings between the sandstone blocks, but at other temples built in the same technique, everything was covered in fresh and soft sandstone, and then it hardened and solidified, and the bindings between construction blocks were filled with lava or sandstone or limestone. In all the interiors, from all the rock-cut caves, the original walls are not completely cleared, so the fine bindings and spaces between blocks are not visible. The restoration work was poorly done, and the walls were not cleared properly. When the new rock has powerful colour pigment, it can be impregnated in the walls of the buildings, but very often the difference in colour and texture can be seen even in YouTube videos. It is clear as black on white that they have different materials, but nobody can take samples to do analysis due to the UNESCO gatekeepers, and also many chambers and passages are restricted from public access. And of course some of the temple inner surface walls will remain uncovered and people will simply excavate the interior chambers. So the final product will look like a cave with interior of a surface building. And people will visit them and take photos and say, wow, look at this fantastic cave art, without knowing that it has a more dramatic story. At Petra we can see this is different stone. We can see this has been cemented or glued onto a different stone type. We can see plaster here. Was it ancient or restoration plastering by UNESCO to cover up the stone blocks connections? But some plastering at old sites was done in ancient times. In the Ellora Cave number 12, they did take a few samples from walls and studied them using scanning electron microscope, SEM, a light microscope, a stereo microscope, and a Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, FTIR. They found cannabis sativa fibers, pounded shoots, leaf fragments, and even one bud. The plaster here is composed of about 10% cannabis, but it's not the norm to let anyone take any samples, and this was only like from the top centimetre or two. There certainly wasn't any drilling allowed into the walls. In ancient times there were amazing techniques and technologies for cutting stone, but after this big event which covered buildings in strata, the cutting technique went back to being basic and crude. We can see cutting techniques used after around 200 BC to expose parts of the already existing constructions. They carve a small hole, then put a wooden wedge in it and hammer it in, then pour in hot water to expand the wood. This doesn't crack the rock open itself, but in a series of holes the rock splits. Here you can see an example. This method here was done with granite, which is super strong. The second phase is to make rectangle patterns, then chisel the rectangles away, or leave one as a raised relief for a sculpture. These cutting techniques are found all around rock-cut caves around the world, and in many places they abandoned the cutting attempt or it simply didn't work. The rock didn't split. In Egypt we can see this technique too. It's also an old method for quarrying stone. We can see it at Petra, these holes. And this big straight wall shows evidence of cutting too. Here's cutting done at what they call the Nabatean tomb in Saudi Arabia. At the temple Abu Simbel in Egypt, we can clearly see that those statues were once inside of a big chamber looking inwards. They've cut the walls, and it's pretty obvious that we're looking at a cover-up attempt. What I'm really showing you is these are petrified towns and temples, and the elite don't want you to know. Or the public will know something big happened in this realm just a few thousand years ago. The Ellora Caves in India is an amazing place. I was there 12 years ago. The official story didn't resonate with me then, and now I know why. The Kailash temple at the Ellora Caves is what I want to focus on. They say that people chiseled this whole place out of solid rock from top down, with simple chisels and hammers, from 757 AD to 783 AD, in just 26 years. This works out at 60 tons of rock being removed every day, somehow. Of course, Wikipedia backs this up, as does the Disney Spinning Balls mainstream. This place is pretty well known as being the largest monolithic structure in the world that was carved out of a single piece of rock. But due to what we all know now, we know this is an ancient temple that got covered in strata and dirt and rock, and they chiseled that out from the top. They chiseled away at just the excess rock, dirt, mud and strata, and they excavated the temple just how the paleontologists uncover bones. The 26 years now feels about right too. Also, sometimes the interior chambers were not completely filled, so they retained their original polished look and art. The lies are insane. Sculptured the whole thing out with a chisel and hammer, working from top to bottom. "Oi Barry, you coming for lunch, mate? Nah, just gonna knock out a few more of these elephants from this solid rock, working top down." Down the road a few miles is the Ajanta Caves. I was here too about 12 years ago. I bumped into a big gang of Indian guys who I don't think they'd seen a white guy before. It was a good day. At Ajanta, when we look just above the already uncovered levels, it can be seen that under the black rock, the lava layer if you like, there are still some covered levels. "Oi Barry, nice sculpting with that chisel, mate. You coming for lunch now?" "Nah, not yet. I want to finish this roof I'm hammering away at from solid rock." "Nice." The Deccan Traps are the label for the large igneous province located on the Deccan Plateau of west-central India, covering thousands of miles. They are one of the largest volcanic features on Earth. Basically, the Deccan Traps are gigantic solidified lava fields which during the last cataclysm covered a big part of ancient India, and the ancient cities were buried beneath them. In these solidified lava layers, we find many of the so-called rock-cut caves. The best-known examples are Ellora and Ajanta. One can also find many non-mainstream YouTube history and geology videos that state many rock-cut caves worldwide were built to resemble a normal building, and that the original builders are just simply unknown. Let us now compare the Paricutin Cathedral from Mexico and the Pandavleni Caves in India. So in 1943, lava from a volcano eruption gobbled up the little Mexican town of San Juan Parangaricutiro, and only the upper part of the town's cathedral remains visible. The rest of the town is completely gone and buried and burned. But the cathedral was made of stone, and much of it got encased in lava. It's 100% lava solidified. And now please compare these images with these from the Pandavleni Caves in India. Again, this is a solidified lava, magma rock. The official lie is that the Pandavleni Caves were carved between the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD. But that is fake. They don't have any proof or evidence for their statements. The images show similar elements between the two constructions, and they prove without a doubt that the Pandavleni Caves are not caves. They are ancient buildings covered by lava, just like the Paricutin Cathedral in Mexico. Here is some interesting footage from a, in quotes, rock-cut cave in Bihar, North India, where many original yoga schools are. This amazing building helps prove it was here before and not chiseled out of a cave.
The interiors are simple, in keeping perhaps with the preferences of the Buddhist and Jain monks who lived here. The exterior of the Lomus Rishi cave, though, presents a contrary sight. Based on the architecture of thatched huts, the exterior has very fine carvings of lattice work, rows of elephants paying homage to Buddhist stupas. The interior of the cave consists of two rectangular halls, a bigger outer hall and a smaller inner hall. The walls may be plain, but it's as smooth polished glass, even thousands of years later. The local guide, who is showing us around in the dark caves, completes the mystical experience by chanting Om. And yes, the sound does sustain itself here in a most curious way.
The echo of the Om stays for approximately 3 seconds. Since these caves were excavated for Jain ascetics, the Ajivikas, they were probably carved in such a way that any sound echoes here. So in between the chants, you can hear the echo of the first one before you go on to the second chant.
On that auspicious note, the sun begins to set, reminding us that it's time to move on. It is difficult to describe this near spiritual experience of this beauteous place. You have to be here to know it.
Okay, I want to show you some more imagery of temples and towns that have 100% been through destruction and covered in magma and are not rock-cut caves. But I'm going to play some music and be quiet for a couple of minutes, just so you could be in the wonder of what is going on. The mainstream archaeologists and UNESCO never explain why so many of the rock-cut cave temples are half destroyed, just like from a cataclysm. I wonder what they want us to believe, that this is some kind of abstract art? That they mixed beautiful building technique with blown to smithereens cave art and rooms? In their prime, these buildings were perfect in form and execution. In every country where there are rock-encased buildings, the local people always have stories and legends about them, and they speak about a great flood and big volcanic eruptions which destroyed the ancient world. What we are seeing are the ruins of our past advanced civilization. UNESCO gatekeepers are putting their hands on all these monuments, and they forbid any alternative investigation or sample drilling. Here's a PDF file that proves that some scientific academics in volcanoes also know ancient cities were engulfed in rock strata. I'm not the only one. It's just a very small minority, and their voice isn't getting heard. Okay, let's go into the next jigsaw piece. Basalt columns. Okay, basalt columns are found all around the world. At present, there are three main theories out there. One, from the mainstream, that these are lava solidified. Two, that these are petrified cells from organic or silica tree stumps from trees that were once many miles high. And number three, petrified muscle fibers of giants. We are only going to use evidence to work this out. So first, what is basalt? Basalt is an extrusive igneous rock that is very dark in colour. It is a dark, fine-grained volcanic-like rock that sometimes displays a columnar structure. Basalt columns' chemical compound is made up of magnesium, silicon, calcium oxides, with small amounts of potassium, sodium, iron and titanium. It also contains the minerals oblivine, which has no cleavage or planes of weakness, pyroxene, which has a 90-degree cleavage and breaks easily, and plagioklasse, which also has 90-degree cleavage and a broken appearance due to fractures. Since two of these three minerals have cleavage, basalt is likely to break and weather in certain conditions. Remember, basalt splits in columns. Here is some imagery regarding cleavage in rocks and minerals. Okay, so millions of people think that these basalt columns were once organic or even silica giant trees. I enjoyed this trees theory. It was wondrous for my imagination, and we know the elite lie about most things, so it's good we contemplate even the most incredulous theories. But unfortunately, this theory I can prove not to be true. If they were trees, there are a few ways they could have become solid rock. If they were organic trees, they must have been through the petrification process, a replacement of all organic matter with minerals, solid basalt in our case. There is no evidence organic matter can petrify into basalt rock. Nothing ever petrified has a remotely similar composition to basalt. Silica accounts for over 90% of all petrified wood. Basalt never contains more than 60% silica. So some others will say they were silica trees that turned into basalt columns. If this was the case, the silica content of the resulting basalt would be even higher than if they were organic trees, over 90%. And basalt is always under 60% silica. Some will then say, but trees have hexagonal fibres. This is not really true. Tree fibres look more like cracked mud. No organic plant life has ever formed a hexagonal structure. Some have semi-hexagonal vacuolar structures, but very irregular. Here are some plant structures that come close, but none are hexagonal in structure. There are also many basalt columns between layers of rock, and there is no evidence of roots or roots burrowing through anything. Okay, so how did basalt columns form then? Magnesium, silicon, calcium oxides forming into rock would take intense heat and oxygen to melt and mix evenly. Some facts. Basalt columns are very hard compared to other rocks. They have an even colour and consistent hardness. They have very similar chemistry to molten lava. The way they crack reveals a structural grain, known to form when hot, hard materials are put under thermal cooling stress. So basalt forms when lava reaches the Earth's surface near a volcano or mid-ocean ridge. The lava is between 1100 and 1250 Celsius when it gets to the surface. It cools quickly, within a few hours, days or weeks, forming solid rock. Hexagonal columns are really to do with the cracks, like a mud puddle after a storm, like Arctic Sea permafrost, both with these shapes. Lava cooled, and contraction was the catalyst for the cracks, and the receding floodwaters exposed them. Basalt has a special characteristic of splitting / cracking in straight lines, and when subjected to equal forces from all sides while rapidly contracting, it simply creates the geometrical shapes. All this takes place during the cataclysm underwater, when tectonic movements and huge earthquakes are taking place. This is why we see basalt columns curving, and many are intersecting and colliding, contorting and twisting. They wave and curve just like the rock strata. The evidences are clear. Jan Laverly, Liverpool professor of volcanology, did some tests and turned basalt back into lava, and then he cooled it, and they saw geometric patterns emerge, and then it started to crack at a cooler heat. What caused the fractures was the intense heat after solidification. Under the right conditions, magma can cool in such a way as to form polygonal shapes that can be straight or bend and twist, but it really all boils down to the physics of cooling. Columns can form in a variety of patterns, mainly hexagonal, but can be found with anywhere from 4 to 8 sides. Now if lava flow runs into some other cold surface, let's say a lava flow comes up against a canyon wall or maybe ice from a glacier, like seen in the Tuyas, you can get columns that look like they're pointed in all directions. All it takes is the right cooling conditions, and you can produce some remarkable geometric features. So all these towers that people think are tree stumps are formed 2 ways. 1. During the cataclysm, when lava shoots up from the seabed and cools rapidly. 2. After the cataclysm, after the huge splitting of Earth crust, as we can see in these examples near Casper, Wyoming. Worth noting here that a local geologist said, in some parts, the gaping hole appeared to look like a mini Grand Canyon. So this is highly likely how some parts of the Grand Canyon were formed. The Devil's Causeway, molten rock flowing over the flooded land, generated lots of steam. It bubbles up through the bottom of the lava, leaving long vertical tubes. At the top and bottom, water quenches and shatters the lava on contact, leaving broken rock. Rapid cooling of the lava underwater produces pillow lavas, squeezed out like a tongue of toothpaste and having a glassy skin. Cooling continues and the solidified rock contracts. Star-shaped cracks appear on the top and bottom solid surfaces. The 3 prongs on the cracks grew longer and join, forming polygons, generally with 4 to 7 sides. Cooling continues, more rock solidifies. The cracks spread upwards and downwards, forming columns. The columns continue to cool. Their height shrinks and they break into pieces with ball and socket joints. Geometry in nature is nothing new. Let us not forget that the simple process of freezing water drops forms snowflakes with beautiful geometry. Even children the age of 10 know that chemical combinations and reactions create geometric minerals. This is repeatable. I see all over YouTube and Facebook people who think this was a tree. I ask, how did it turn to granite? they don't know. I ask, where is the rest of the tree? They don't know. I ask, where is the root system? They don't know. And then I ask, well, what about this? They say, yeah, it's like splintered tree stumps. And then I say, well, what about this? And this again is from the same mountain range in Italy. And they say, yeah, it's like these are all remains of trees. And this for me isn't the opinion of any serious investigator or scholar. This was doing the rounds recently too. Some shill Facebook page with about 40,000 likes, and unweaned conspiracy theorists sharing this nonsense about. It's just CGI. There's no proof here for a root system. And ask yourself why shill sites are posting fake root system information. They want you to believe in the trees theory. So ask yourself why. Then there are this other lot who claim basalt columns are the muscle fibres of giants. And this is pretty ludicrous. So what about orbicular basalt? Are these trees or muscles too? This orbicular pattern can only occur in a particular condition of rapid cooling, and it can be repeated. There are also many online who think these granite rocks are ancient giants, ancient titans, just because it visually looks like a giant. There's no real science for this, no bones nearby or anything. There is only a sentence in Genesis and one or two in the Book of Enoch. There is also the Book of Giants, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This talks of giants and monsters, and doesn't contain the word stone once. It does contain the word brimstone 4 times, and this word actually means sulphur or fire. The expression fire and brimstone is used as a sign of God's wrath, for example, a cataclysm. Many even think this was a real elephant. Now, about 18 years ago, I went on a day trip in Thailand to what they call Chicken Island. Chicken Island, they used to say. You go Chicken Island, long time? And I suppose these conspiracy theorists think this is a real giant chicken? I would like to say you couldn't make this stuff up, but certain government shills do actually make this stuff up. You see, many new unweaned conspiracy theorists got caught up in the flat earth information too soon, and they wet their pants at any fantasy story with deceiving tactics. Probably because they saw a 9/11 and Sandy Hook video, and their lives are controlled by the American government and IRS, and they need to revolt wherever possible. Now, I personally do think it is possible giants may have existed before the cataclysm. This is unrelated to the granite lookalikes. This is a whole new research field altogether, and not for this documentary. But to say different sized giants turn to granite in about 50 places around the world, this is just kind of crazy, and there's nothing to back this up. Basalt columns are simply evidence of mass volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and flooding, all happening at the same time, or very much near the same time. Mainstream volcanic academics are not too far wrong when it comes to basalt columns, due to the evidence we've just looked at. I want to digress for a few minutes and lay down the mud floods jigsaw piece, as this subject is getting very popular in the truth movement at the moment. So it does seem that in the late 1700s or even 1800s there were some mud floods around the world. No lava, no earthquakes, no tsunamis, just mud floods from landslides and rain, it seems. These popular YouTube channels also insist repeatedly on old buildings which are under new ones. This is pretty much the case in most cities. This is not something too unusual for me. So, there were local floods which brought mud into cities, and the people didn't remove the mud and it remained. So the first floors were left buried. And depending on the local geography, like if the city had a river through it, The river also brought mud and debris, and the cities were severely flooded and covered in mud. But this is not to be mixed with the gigantic cataclysm around 3,000–4,000 years ago, which literally smashed the whole ancient world to pieces and sunk entire huge areas of our flat Earth. The big cataclysm, which sunk entire kingdoms and continents and destroyed the megalithic structures, was not the same event that buried the first floors of buildings in European cities. The problem is that these YouTubers intentionally or unintentionally mix the ancient cataclysmic event with some more recent and much smaller local events from the last centuries. The linked quarry theory is flimsy too. A quarry for what? Silica trees? We prove that's not true. In 1816, just after the War of 1812, there was a year without summer, and it's likely that some extreme weather or sun activity caused these smaller and localized events. There was no worldwide cataclysm from 1700 to 1900. These people are literally muddying the waters. It might be a smoke and mirrors gig to hide us from the big event 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. We must be wary. If we hear an academic Russian accent on YouTube with images we haven't seen before, it doesn't mean the whole gig is true or really that important. So what other evidence can we find of a big cataclysm 3,000 to 4,000 years ago? There is the worldwide flood story pointing to a few thousand years ago. With this, though, many just think of the Bible or the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the fact is there are over 500 myths around the world. To name a few, we have Hawaii, Australia, Finland, Greece, China, India and Chile. These myths are everywhere, and universal destruction and flooding were mentioned in nearly all of them. Bruce Mass, co-editor of Myth and Geology in the 60s, was a globe-head archaeologist. But after much research about the flood, he gave the date of 2807 BC. But I see it as being 3,000–4,000 years ago, so more recent than 2000 BC. Here are a couple of documentaries that show evidence of remains of some gigantic boats found at over 1,000 meters altitude. Have a look at these if you're interested. I lived in Guatemala for a while, and the Maya's Dresden Codex was all about monitoring Venus cycles and movements. Then on the very last page, it shows a flood coming out of the Dark Rift. This also links to my Dark Rift documentary if you've not checked that out yet. There are also many underwater cities and megalithic constructions. The mainstream experts say they were originally on the surface and somehow ended up underwater. But of course, this is all evidence of a cataclysm. This is in Japan. This is Egypt near Alexandria. And Greece. These are in India. And this is in China. There are about 20 that we know about, which means probably hundreds that we don't know about, or even under the seabed or under or inside underwater mountains. There are also cities under jungle or earth. Many Maya cities are still uncovered. Also there is the unknown megalith the size of the Giza pyramid underground at Kabardino-Balkaria mountain range in Russia. Almost nothing is known about this place, save for a massive construction within and below a mountain. Ancient local legend says this peak was made by giants. Another key to there being a large cataclysm and flood is the lack of granite mixing.
Where blobs of the granodiorite have been included in the basalt. And this indicates that where we know molten material has interacted with rock, it does produce mixing. And so that really raises questions about the conventional wisdom that would normally explain these rocks that we see here as perhaps being several melts cooling at the same time. They should have mixed, but these relationships show that they haven't. This leads us then to ask the question, is there another possible explanation for the origin of these rocks, these granites?
So the molten granite was cooled fast because all was happening underwater. So remember, the radio halos in granite show that these granites had to have occurred instantly or within 4 minutes. So magma cooled quickly and went hard quickly. So the cataclysm and the flood both occurring at the same time does indeed yield the only scientific explanation. Have a little look at how lava acts underwater. Also, it's possible that all the mountains in the world were formed underwater. But once again, this information is ignored by mainstream geologists. A seamount or goyot is a mountain risen from the ocean seabed that does not reach the water's surface. 10,000 seamounts and 300 goyots covering a total of 3 million square miles have been mapped, but only a few have been studied in detail. Near the equator, the mid-Atlantic ridge is divided into the North Atlantic ridge and the South Atlantic ridge by the Romanche Trench. This is a narrow trench with a maximum depth of 8,000 meters. Here is the mid-Atlantic ridge running through Iceland overland for any wise, vigilant skeptics out there. In the Origins of Mountains book, it is explained that most geologists and geophysicists assume that the mountain building process of horizontal compression caused the folds we see in the mountains today, but that plate tectonics explains very few mountains. On page 297 it states, "A great many mountains, plateaus and other landscape features have no apparent relationship to plate tectonic situations." In Michael Oard's 2001 paper titled Vertical Tectonics and the Drainage of Floodwater, he states, "The uplift and dissection of the planation's surfaces fits in neatly within the flood model, especially the recessive stage of the flood. The folding of strata can occur mostly during the inundatory stage due to rapid sedimentation and tectonics in which huge masses of consolidation to partly consolidated strata slide down slope. It is interesting that the authors find analogues for folded strata from mass movement along the continental margin. In other words, the folds we now see in ancient rocks on the continents likely happened underwater." Some other researchers also say there are fossils bearing marine limestones that form at the summit of Everest and the Andes, but this is a whole documentary in itself. But we do need to have a quick look at fossils' evidence of a big cataclysm. Velikovsky was a genius, but also a globehead, bit of a paradox for sure. He wrote 2 amazing books about a massive cataclysm around 1500 BC. He presented evidence of animal fossils smashed against cliffs and mountains. He said the extinction of many species had occurred catastrophically. He said the cataclysm was fireballs, floods, giant tides, and the sun acting a little crazy. He has evidence from Alaska, North Siberia, and of sea and land being moved and changed. He says the story of Exodus in the Bible is linked to this cataclysm. Fossil Butte National Monument is also where inconsistencies between accepted theory and fossil evidence exists. The mass burial and deposition of millions of fish demands a theory of catastrophism, similar to that required in the Grand Canyon. These strata chevrons are evidence of mass destruction, and many times they display microfossils displaced from the bottom of the ocean. Bruce Mass, who we spoke of earlier, stumbled across dozens of these fossils all across the shores of Africa and Asia, and wrote of tsunamis 600 feet high, some carrying boulders half a mile inland. Moving on, there are about 1,500 potentially active volcanoes worldwide, aside from the continuous belt of volcanoes on the ocean floor. About 50 to 60 eruptions happen each month. Some volcanoes are in constant activity, Stromboli, Kilauea, or Sakurajima for example. There are about 169 volcanoes in the United States alone. The Ring of Fire is a swarm of 452 volcanoes, most of which are far under the ocean's surface. And as we can see here, many have shown activity in just the last year. If we look at the Ring of Fire on a conceptual flat Earth map, it's very much a straight line. Now, some flat Earth shills, or fools, have been saying volcanoes don't exist. Here is me about 13 years ago next to lava. And this nearby volcano in the background recently popped in Guatemala. Some other, quote, researchers, unquote, say supervolcanoes don't exist. I asked them to go to these locations and do some basic research. Some other flat Earth researchers, quote unquote, say tectonic plates don't exist. Moving on. Underwater images of the seabed surrounding the Hawaiian Islands show that they are surrounded by huge aprons of debris shed from their volcanoes. A writer, Bill McGuire, said, "Within this great jumbled mass of volcanic cast-offs, nearly 70 individual giant landslides have been identified. Such a landslide caused the 1,000-foot mega tsunami that hit the island of Lanai. All of this evidence shows that the large cataclysm that occurred was full of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes under the water, under the flood. Remember, an underwater volcano eruption is sometimes linked to an earthquake, and both create tsunamis." So what conclusions can we come to? Coal, granite and strata can each be formed quickly, and probably were all mostly formed 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. A massive cataclysm of volcanic eruption, earthquake, tsunami and flooding wiped out the ancient world, and only remnants can be seen in what UNESCO hide as the rock-cut caves. It's probable that more than 80% of the Earth's surface, above and below sea level, is of volcanic origin. Volcanic eruptions have produced mountains, plateaus and plains, which subsequently eroded and weathered into the majestic landscapes and fertile soils we see today. But what causes a volcano, and where does lava come from? We simply don't know. Humans have only dug a few miles down. We do know, though, that in the Vedic and Abrahamic flat Earth cosmologies, that higher vibrational realms are above, and darker, lower vibrational realms are below. It does seem, though, that we are having a human experience in the remnants and graveyard of an amazing ancient advanced civilization. Look around the world today, and we can see there was an advanced civilization. This Atlantis wasn't one single location, it was a consciousness, a culture. Similar pyramids, similar art, and similar polygon walls are found all around the world. Even hieroglyphics have been found in Australia. The cataclysm 3,000 to 4,000 years ago was a major reset. No trees on Earth survived, and only the greatest of architectural splendour and temples survived. It seems probable that the few thousand or few tens of thousands of humans that survived spread out to become the Tibetan monks, the Maya, the shaman, the yogis, the Inca, the Taoists, and also the Druids. Many years ago, some mystics told me that Noah and the patriarchs were those with high levels of initiation, hidden in their ages of hundreds of years, and it was their job to protect sacred knowledge while the destruction and floods came, to keep safe for survivors, for the future. So the big question is, what caused this big reset cataclysm? The reset could be cyclic, linked to the clockwork of luminaries above, or it could be related to the sun cycles alone, or Venus cycles alone. It could be divine. It could be technological from a culture gone haywire, or even some advanced group intention. I personally am erring on cyclic due to the Maya Dresden Codex and my knowledge of astrology, and because the night sky has been anthropomorphized with animals and deity for centuries and pointed to relentlessly by ancient sacred sites. Also, the human design system, similar to astrology one could say, states there will be a big change in 2027. Interesting to note here is that in my human design it says I am a heretic investigator. Also interesting to note that in Japan they found these ancient tsunami warning stones. It is said in Japan that it takes only 3 generations for people to forget about cataclysm. Check out this Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek astrological analog computer. It was found in the sea around 1901 and is believed to be over 2,000 years old. It has 30 meshing bronze gears and charts the movement of the sun, moon and planets, and predicts lunar and solar eclipses.
Housed in a rectangular frame, the machine shows data on both sides. In front is the larger dial, showing the 365 days of the year according to the Egyptian solar calendar. Inside, a second circle shows the 12 signs of the zodiac. By turning a handle, one could position the 2 hands to indicate, for each day of the year, the exact position of the sun and moon, and a small sphere indicating the phase of the moon. In order to guarantee its exactitude, whatever the day or year chosen, a dial on the back of the mechanism shows the metonic cycle, which reflects lunar and solar cycles over a period of 19 years, corresponding to 235 lunar months. Above this, another spiral dial indicates eclipses of the sun and moon. The handle was used to advance the pointer to determine when the next eclipse would occur in the Saros cycle. As these operations were connected by the interlocking gears, the actual date of the eclipse showed on the other dial. How did the Greeks manage to devise a mechanism to reflect such complex and irregular data as the lunar cycles? The question also intrigues today's specialists in fine watchmaking.
These dudes went to a lot of trouble to map the sky's clockwork. Moving on, Dr. Thomas Burnet, a theologian, wrote from the 1680s The Sacred Theory of Earth, made up of 4 books. He wrote that the Big Reset cataclysm was as close as around 0 AD. He wrote that before this cataclysm there were no seas, mountains or hills, and he postulated that the floodwaters came from above or the great deep, both Abrahamic notions. Another strange key is that there are so many new movies coming out about destruction and cataclysm. Here are 2 new ones. Why do the Georgia Guidestones talk of keeping population down? Why the chemtrails in low populous areas but masking the sun? Why the billions of tax dollars spent on DUMBs over 1 kilometre underground? DUMB stands for Deep Underground Military Base. Why the strange Walmart closures and mass works going on? It's hard to know, as we don't have all the jigsaw pieces. It's obvious that much, if not all, the ancient history in the mainstream is completely fabricated. Even more recently, in the 1700s, they rewrote many stories and removed many maps, which I explained in my Other Lands video. They are also lying about population numbers, and this makes even more sense when we think of a reset 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So 100,000 humans or so turned into 8 billion in just a few millennia. That doesn't really make too much sense. Okay, in this final musing section, I want to go back to the Longmen grottos in China. Here, there are over 100,000 statues and over 2,300 caves. Okay, they say they were cut out from the caves from 493 AD to 1127 AD, but again there is no real evidence of this. Just Wikipedia and Mickey Mouse stuff. Regarding the Big Buddha, Wikipedia says an inscription at the base of this figure gives 676 AD as the year of carving. And that's it. You're just supposed to believe this little carving at the bottom of the foot. Okay, from what we know about these rock-cut caves and rock-cut temples, this for sure looks like a place that was there already before a cataclysm and was covered in the cataclysm. It also looks like this was all indoors, inside a massive chamber, and the focal point of this now buried city. So this raises a big problem. We are told that Buddha was born in 623 AD, and these statues seem like they were there before the cataclysm. So this yields two possible solutions. One, this statue is actually of an old important ruler, and they are plonking the Buddha person, story and archetype onto it. Or two, Buddha was much older than 600 AD. Either way, they are lying. I looked at these photos in a kind of altered state of consciousness, sort of soft focus for a while. I felt these to be superior beings that actually walked this earth millennia ago. I mean, look at this one, holding a Mount Meru type thing in his palm and treading on a small human. Were these statues of giants or deities of some sort? Okay, if you do a search on Longmen grottos, Google gives you pages and pages of strong gatekeeper websites from Mickey Mouse and the Matrix. Wikipedia, World Heritage, UNESCO, TripAdvisor, New York Times, the Chinese State, High Up Buddhism, major travel tours. This seems to be one place they really don't want you sniffing around. I searched online for quite a while trying to find the names of the deities and could only find one website, and this is at artandarchaeology.com. And they list these statues as being these deities. With no proof, it's just the only website in the world that says this. Now I found out the webmaster of this site is a Michael Gunter, with no personal email address, just a webmaster email. He has no YouTube, no books, nothing on Google Images, and isn't able to be found online. His name just appears on this one page on the internet. This isn't normal and has all the hallmarks of a shill site, set up by one or more of UNESCO, the Chinese State and Buddhism. This whole art and archaeology website is a shill webpage too, covering ancient sites all around the world. See the email I sent to the webmaster address. I got no reply and it was sent weeks ago. So we have to ask the question, is UNESCO, the Chinese government and mainstream Buddhism all involved in a massive cover-up of the Buddhist story too? This would need more research, but it does look likely. I mean, this dude looks like a great ruler. Also look at the Leshman giant Buddha, also in China. Well, Mickey Mouse says this was carved between 713 AD and 803 AD, and again there is no proof of this. Now maybe some foolish dreamers will swear this is a petrified giant who was meditating with his eyes open under a giant tree and got covered in a mud flood. But you've got to be careful where you're going on YouTube. Attila Flink was a linguistic historian. He said that when the Pope found out that Incas were speaking a certain language, he ordered the Spanish to wipe them out. Millions of them. The East India Company wiped out many shaman tribes too. Maybe the Jesuits were ridding the world of the remnants of the ancient civilization. For sure, Sanskrit was around before the Cataclysm and was a part of the ancient world. All these so-called rock-cut caves were not empty after the flood. The vast and many Vedic Sanskrit literature was for sure found in many of these places. Also, what are these 30 miles of catacombs in Paris? 6 million dead humans beneath a city? Some say there are 200 miles of catacomb tunnels and only a small amount are open to the public. The official story is in 1786, overflowing graveyards were relocated from cemeteries. I mean, do you really believe that? Oi mate, I'm just going to move your nan's skull to a catacomb. Is that alright, yeah? We're digging her up tonight. Many of the big cities today have older cities buried under them by the giant cataclysm. And catacombs are for sure under many cities. Rome, Odessa, Palermo, Malta, Vienna, to name a few that we know about. So many underground catacombs, maybe even sewage systems and underground metro tunnels, may actually be remnants of the old civilization. You see here in Paris, stone building with solidified magma above. Remind you of anything? The zombies think the catacombs are a tourist attraction. They pay money to go down there and take selfies. As Marcus Garvey once said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. Spend a moment, if you can, for those lives lost in the Big Reset, for those that built those amazing temples and buildings. Think of those in power that lied and danced on their graves and erased them from history. The same gang you give your tax to, the same gang you take orders from. Think of all the silly Catholics too that have no idea that the Vatican holds the knowledge of what happened. The current system is unnatural. Look around. Tradition and sacredness have been replaced with consumption, fear, slavery, control and selfishness. And a warped egoistic seeking of observers in an online popularity contest. For the masses, how much money one has is the barometer of popularity and respect. It's pathetic and toxic. Having opened our eyes to a disenchanted world, we are more than any others the children of the absurd. In certain days, the senselessness of the current world weighs on us like a deformity. It may seem to us that the Creator has died of old age, and we exist without a goal. We were born among the ruins. The gold was already transmuted into lead. But now here we are, and we are waking up, and we have a duty to share and progress these unfolding truths. In this time of amnesia, and probable soon to come AI dystopia, truth and desire for freedom can truly save us, individually and collectively.